That is We the Kingdom on Rhema, a song from them called Don't Let the Darkness Get You Down. It is just after 10:30. Andrew Urquhart with you on the program today. There's been simmering tensions in Iran for some time. Well, in Iran itself, those tensions have boiled over weeks ago, of course, with people protesting on the streets, reports of hundreds, thousands of people killed by the government there, and then the US response with a fleet assembled in the Persian Gulf. What exactly is happening in Iran and what is likely to happen next? Joining me on the program now, geopolitical expert with a specialisation in the Middle East, Dr. Jeffrey Miller. Jeffrey, kia ora. Thanks for your time today.
Good morning, Andrew.
This is a situation which has had a long time coming. From what we know, though, what is currently happening in Iran? What has led to the current internal tensions there?
Yeah, it's a long story. It's a very good timeline that the Associated Press put together that I was looking on yesterday, going back decades, really, and looking at how we got to this point. I guess in the short term, what led to these protests in Iran was a complete collapse in the economic situation, which had been already dire for some time because of sanctions. But there was the reimposition of what we call snapback sanctions last year, really from the UN. And that really seemed to be the straw that broke the camel's back, led to a collapse in the Iranian rial and a collapse in the in currency, hyperinflation, and that led to the unrest that we saw pretty much just after Christmas and around early January. And then you recall that Iran switched the internet off. And so these mass protests that bubbled away in Iran, we still don't know exactly what went on, I think, to any great degree. Iran itself has admitted around 3,000 people were killed. So that's from the Iranian regime. Opposition activists suggest the figure is much, much higher and could be somewhere around 7,000. Donald Trump talks of 32,000. So we're talking about deaths in the thousands.
Yes.
And those protests were suppressed, it seems, by the regime. But there's now a new round just in the last few days centered on universities. There's a lot of discontent in Iran. It's been building for years, mainly as a result of the economic situation and as a result of the crippling sanctions that have been imposed by the United States and by many, many other countries under the UN sanctions. And they're now all in place because the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, in other words, the Iranian nuclear deal of 2015, has completely and utterly broken down. So the United States pulled out of that in 2018, but now it's really fully collapsed in terms of the other partners to that deal. And that's what that snapback of sanctions refers to that came in 2025.
We'll go back to that in just a moment, but just wanting to say, in your opinion, from what we do know, is it purely a response to the horrific economic situation for Iranians, or is there a general pushback against what has been for many years a controlling regime? Is there a groundswell similar to what we saw a few years back with the Arab Spring?
Look, I'm not there on the ground in Iran, and I think these situations invariably come about as a result of a range of different factors. And there will be plenty of people who are very unhappy with the regime. There would be many people who are simply struggling to get by. And I guess they all come together in a sense of discontent and unhappiness. And in a sense, the motivation why they're unhappy and why they're protesting is almost secondary. I guess there will be some who simply want the regime to fall. There'll be others who will be appeased if the economic situation begins to improve. And you know, there's probably a fuzzy line between some of those.
I suppose the question that I'm dancing around here is this a groundswell from within Iran, or is this a attempt at regime change by cutting the economic cable from the West? is this discontent in some ways seeded by the sanctions from the West? Is it a natural consequence of those sanctions rather than a general uprising of the people against their government, not influenced by Western diplomacy or sanctions?
Well, jury's out on all of that. Really, not to dodge the question, but
Hmm.
I would say, look, sanctions always sound good on paper. But for decades, Cuba has been under sanctions. Iran has now been under sanctions for many, many years. Uh, many regimes have been under sanctions. North Korea could be another
Yep.
example. And yet, sanctions just don't seem to really work in most cases. Why? Because they do tend to galvanize support to a degree also behind the regimes that are being punished effectively, because the regimes can sell sanctions as punishment by the West. This is the United States. We need to stand up
It
to the
gives them an
United States.
external enemy in some ways.
It does.
Yeah, yeah.
It does. And the other reason I would add is the other reason why sanctions don't work is that there are loopholes and there are ways around
Yeah.
them and there are workarounds. And when you have friends that don't comply with the sanctions, and Iran has some powerful friends, um, then uh, then they don't really work for that reason. So you can get in your supplies through other means. So they always sound good on paper, and we've seen Western countries apply heavy sanctions against Russia,
Mm,
and yet the Russian economy is still chugging along. Again, Russia has some powerful friends,
yeah.
and there are loopholes and ways of getting in all kinds of resources through unofficial channels. So th this is the problem, I guess, that you have with sanctions. They sound good on paper, but in the end, they've got issues, let's say.
And let's talk about what is currently happening in the Persian Gulf with the assembling of the US fleet, well, certainly a proportion of it. And well, some commentators saying that there could be an all-out assault. US could be at war with Iran within days. Is this just saber rattling, or is this potentially what may happen next, Jeffrey?
Look, we need to take this seriously. This is the biggest US military buildup in the Middle East since 2003,
Hmm.
since the Iraq War in 2003. And the US has over a dozen warships. They've got two aircraft carriers in the region, the Abraham Lincoln and the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carriers. The Gerald R. Ford carrier is the biggest that the United States has to offer. They've got over 100 warplanes, F-16s, F-22s, all the top US uh, fighter aircraft. They've got 200 cargo planes for supplies. They've got over 100 tanker aircraft. They've got the kitchen sink pretty much
Yep.
stationed off Iran there. And I think we have to take that seriously. Uh, that said, it seems that we've been sort of days away from war for quite a long time now.
Yes.
It felt a good 6 weeks ago that the US might mount a strike against Iran, but Donald Trump appeared to pull back at that point in mid-January.
Hmm.
There was another moment, I think, at the end of January, where Donald Trump seemed to be ready to pounce, but then pulled back. And since then, we've gone into a pattern of talks and diplomacy, and Donald Trump has talked up diplomacy. And there's a third round of talks between Iran and the United States, indirect talks
Yep.
brokered by Oman, that will be held in Geneva today, on Thursday, as we record this.
Hmm.
Uh, so we will see whether those talks come to anything, but it seems that both sides are quite far apart
Yep.
in their negotiating positions. And it really remains to be seen if they can do a deal, or whether Donald Trump will conduct some kind of military strikes.
Mm.
But I think Trump is in a bit of a bind, because the question is, what does he actually do? Because if he wants regime change, some airstrikes are just unlikely to bring that about.
Yep.
And again, like sanctions, might lead to greater support internally for the regime. I mean, Iran survived that 12-day war in June last year. So what does Donald Trump do? He certainly doesn't have ground troops, and that is the big difference between now and 2003.
Yep.
Back in 2003, the United States had 250,000 troops stationed in the Middle East, ready to invade Iraq. The United States doesn't have ground troops ready to invade Iran at this time, and there's no appetite
Yeah.
for that at all internally in the United States.
One of the things which almost seems ironic in this regard is that, if anything, one of the possible explanations is this is a show of strength whilst they go back to the negotiating table and try and do a deal perhaps not dissimilar to the deal that Donald Trump and others walked out on back in 2018. It kind of brings us back to filling in a hole that Trump himself has dug.
Indeed, and the problem that Trump has got, of course, is that unless he does a deal that is better than the one he tore up in 2018, he's going to be excoriated by both his base and his opponents
Yeah.
in the United States. And yet the deal that Iran is sort of offering actually seems to be worse from the rumor mill than what they agreed to back in 2018. So there are all kinds of limits and conditions in the Iranian nuclear deal, the original one, the JCPOA, as diplomats call it. But one of them was to limit nuclear enrichment to under 5%.
Yeah.
Well, the talk is that Iran is promising to limit its enrichment of uranium to 20% this time around.
Yeah.
Well, you don't need to be a maths wizard to work out one number is higher than the other.
Yeah.
The other thing is that Donald Trump talked about missiles, Iran's missile program, also being part of any new deal, and its support for proxies around the region. In other words, the likes of Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen.
Mm-hmm.
And there's absolutely no talk now of that being on the table. And Iran has quite skillfully, I think, reframed this as being about the nuclear program. So you kind of wonder, where is the middle ground here? And I guess that could be an argument that maybe Donald Trump will go in there with the military action. But we come back to what I said a couple of minutes ago. The problem for Donald Trump is that airstrikes won't bring about regime change, or are very unlikely to do so. And he's very unwilling, I think, to send in ground troops. I mean, I think that's just off the table. So how do you actually do this without coming up looking at like a bit of a chump in the end and a bit of a failure with some symbolic airstrikes that don't really change the realities?
Now,
and could precipitate a wider war, by the way,
yeah,
I would add. And Iran may retaliate more strongly this time than they did back in June 2025.
Just finally on the regime change, because there seems to be a movement. As we say, this has been heavily repressed by the Iranian regime, but there seems to be a movement both within Iran, people who are prepared to take to the streets, even risking their lives. Certainly in the Iranian diaspora across the world, there is a call for regime change. However, the Iranian regime at the moment hold on to power pretty strongly, pretty harshly. Do you think regime change, whether it be by sanctions or by military action or by a groundswell from the Iranian people, is likely?
Look, in short, I don't. I think also you have to be careful what you wish for when it comes to regime change.
Yeah.
We saw regime change in Iraq in 2003. Didn't work out exactly how George W. Bush intended. We've seen regime change in Libya. Didn't again work out perhaps the way that the US thought it would. I think regime change will only work if it really truly happens organically internally in Iran. I don't think you can enforce regime change from the outside by bombing Iran. I think diplomacy is the way to go, I would add. And I don't think Donald Trump is wrong, by the way, to pursue diplomacy. He emphasized diplomacy in a State of the Union speech yesterday, while also saying, Iran couldn't be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, etc. It would be good to see a deal done. At the moment, I think both parties are quite far apart, but it would be good to have a deal. I think we should always go for those diplomatic solutions, the peaceful solutions, try and work something out. War should always be the last resort, and it's unlikely to solve anything here. The war in June last year didn't solve anything. At the time, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu did a victory lap and claimed that the nuclear program had been destroyed. Well, it clearly hasn't, because they're coming back to this whole issue again. So all of that that war last time around, and the strikes on the Fordo nuclear facility, etc., all seem to be a bit pointless. And you don't want the same thing happening again, or worse, because this could turn into a major regional war, and it's already leading to consequences around the world, not least of which is the oil price, which is now over the $70 a barrel mark.
Yeah.
And that could go much, much higher if war does break out.
Jeffrey, really appreciate your insight and analysis as always. Thanks once again for being on the program today.
Hey, you're very welcome, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.